Welcome to the Caregiver channel for the Brain Injury Association of York Region. My name is Remy Perry. Back in 2015, my wife sustained a brain injury in a car accident that resulted in a condition called post-concussion syndrome. 9 years later, she's still living with it. As for me, I've joined the BIAYR board representing caregivers. Today, I am joined by Caron Gan, an individual, couples, and family therapist who has spent more than 30 years treating both those experiencing traumatic brain injury and the people who care for them. Through the Bloorview Research Institute, she has conducted studies on the effects of acquired brain injury, or ABI, on families. She has published numerous articles on family assessment and intervention, and she was a lead developer of brain injury family intervention for adolescents. She has also contributed resources to the website for OBIA, the Ontario Brain Injury Association. We'll have a link to that and any other resources that we talk about in the description below. Welcome, Caron, and thanks for talking to us.
Oh, thanks so much for inviting me, Remy. And as I was reflecting on this podcast and reflecting over the 35 years that I've worked in the field, it's interesting timing because I am winding down my career. This is the final phase of my professional career in the brain injury field. And so it's very timely doing this podcast because what I'm about to share reflects the learning, the wisdom that I've acquired from working with the amazing individuals and families over the past 35 years. So this podcast is dedicated to all the survivors and family members who have taught me everything that I've learned.
You have so much clinical experience, but you've also been at the research end of things as well. So you've combined those over more than 3 decades, which is absolutely amazing. To jump right into it, the effects of an acquired brain injury, an ABI or a TBI, traumatic brain injury, many medical professionals, the health profession tends to focus on the physical aspects and the effects on the survivor themselves. But there are profound effects that an ABI can have on not only the survivor, but the caregiver, those around them. And I'd like to jump in with asking you the first question. What, in your experience, is the biggest effect that an acquired brain injury has on the relationship between caregiver and survivor?
Well, the effects of I'm going to use ABI throughout this
Sure,
podcast, if that's okay.
absolutely.
So the effects of the ABI are quite broad, and the focus changes depending on the stage of rehabilitation. So you mentioned earlier how the medical professionals are often focused on the physical aspects, and that makes sense. At the acute care stage, it's important to stabilize the individual and get that person on a trajectory of physical recovery. And the physical recovery and the physical effects often make sense to families when they are informed at the early stage. But the other effects of the brain injury, such as changes in thinking, emotional behavioral changes, they begin to emerge more over time. And those are the aspects of the ABI that are more challenging for families to make sense of because it's a whole new ballgame when they're dealing with changes in thinking, changes in memory, changes in concentration, changes in personality, changes in behavior. So that affects the relationships in the family and primarily between the caregiver and the person with the brain injury because it's the caregiver who has to take on the bulk of the work in supporting the rehabilitation and the ongoing recovery of the person with the brain injury. So the roles change, and depending on whether it's a spousal caregiver or a parent of a child or a sibling or a son or daughter of a person with a brain injury, those roles can impact different people differently.
You mentioned that there are behavioral changes on the part of the injured, the person dealing with, I should say, the brain injury. You mentioned in talks that I've seen you give irritability, anger. Sometimes they feel like a child. Could you speak to that? Their role changes.
Yeah, it's not uncommon for the behavioral changes, the irritability to emerge over time. And a lot of that may have to do with the area of the brain that was injured. So we know that the front part of the brain, the frontal lobes, is responsible for organization, planning, emotional control, impulse control. So when that part of the brain becomes affected, it can make it more difficult for the injured individual to control their impulses. And so there may be more behavior that is risky or impulsive. People may be thinking, doing things without thinking or acting without thinking. There could be difficulties with controlling anger, controlling mood. So that often plays out at home. And the person who is often the recipient of these frustrations is often the primary caregiver, whether it be the parent or the spouse. And so that makes it very difficult for the caregiver to manage because this is often a different behavior than before. And so it's not uncommon for caregivers, spousal caregivers, to say things like, "This is not the person I married."
Mm.
And if there's impulsive behaviors or people are doing things without thinking, it can sometimes feel like I'm married to a child versus the adult. And so it's a real experience of loss for the caregiver. And if the person with the injury needs cueing or needs support to manage the behaviors or to manage the emotions, then they could feel like they're treated like a child. So the aspects of the brain injury can shift the dynamics between caregivers and the person with the injury. Nobody wants to be in a caregiving role. And no person with a brain injury wants to be supported and told what they have to do. But the nature of the brain injury creates this kind of dynamic. So part of the work and support is to untangle these changes and help caregivers better understand why these changes are happening, what is common, and what is actually normal after brain injury, and figuring out strategies to manage these changes. Because the way you manage the irritability or behavior changes after a brain injury are often different than how you would deal with them on a day-to-day basis. So the education part is really integral for all these families.
I guess it's a fine line between giving care and infantilizing or making the person receiving the care feel like they're helpless and
Yeah.
generating learned helplessness. The other thing you talked about is how often someone who is suffering from a brain injury, who is also a parent, feels like they have a loss of parental control because their brain injury may make that more difficult. And by the same token, the caregiver assumes the responsibility. They feel often like a single parent because a
Yeah.
lot of it falls on them.
And that's a really good point, Remy. If it's a parent who's been injured, it really compromises the strength of the hierarchy between parents working together. We know these days that raising kids is tough enough,
Mhm.
and often parents have to rely on one another and get support from one another, bounce ideas off of one another. But when a parent, one of those parents has been injured, there's the loss of that kind of support in the parental relationship. So the non-injured parent often has to figure things out on their own more than they typically would have. And if they're also having to manage the emotional or behavioral changes in their spouse, it sometimes feels like they've taken on another child and that they're having to parent not just their own kids on his or her own, but having to take on the added role of the person who's injured. So it can create the semblance of a single parent situation for the non-injured spouse. And the kids in the family feel that as well. So the kids could feel like a loss of the parent that who used to be prior to the injury. If there are personality changes, it may be hard for the kids to make sense of why is daddy or mommy
Mm.
behaving differently? Why are they talking differently? Why can't they remember things when I tell them? So the kids need to be informed and educated about the brain injury as well. And because there's a shift of roles with the non-injured parent taking on more responsibilities, they may have less time for the other kids in the family. So the kids can really feel it. And it's not uncommon for the kids to sometimes share that it feels like I've lost both parents. My mom or dad is so busy taking care of my other parent, they have less time for me. So there's a real sense of loss and confusion for the other kids in the family. And it's not uncommon for one of the kids to step up to assume more of a
Clearly.
caretaking role as well. So
Become like the parent.
exactly. If they see that mom or dad is so stressed and taking on additional roles and supporting the injured parent, they may feel stressed and worried for the non-injured parent themselves. So they may step up and take on what in the therapy world we call parentified role, where they take on the functions and some of the responsibilities of the injured parent.
Is that something that you would encourage, or is that something to try to avoid, or is it simply just something you have to accept?
Well, I see it as something that happens quite often, and it's not something I would encourage because we want
Kids to have a child.
and to take on a parental role, even though they're to be applauded for being so caring and supportive and wanting to help out their family, it's important that they also not feel responsible because it's a heavy toll that's taken on them. And so it's figuring out ways in the family for some of those supports to take place without the kids in the family feeling responsible. Perhaps they could take on other roles that could still acknowledge that they're still the kids in the family. And the other thing that's really important is if it's an injured parent, it doesn't mean they can't assume some of the roles that they had before. So it's figuring out maybe what can mommy or daddy still do that may be difficult. So, for example, it's not uncommon for me to get the parents to figure out what kinds of things that they can still do with the child. Can they still read? Can they still
Right.
play? Can they
Exactly.
still watch TV together? So it's trying to protect as many of those pre-injury roles and experiences as possible. Although a lot has changed, not 100% has changed, and it's figuring out what still remains.
I imagine it's pretty tempting for someone who is the non-injured caregiver and parent to, when there is a competent eldest child or any of the children, to over rely on them, or whether or not
Mm.
it's the parent who's injured or a sibling. I remember watching one of the videos that you shared earlier, and there was a sibling who really had to deal with her brother a lot more than she should have had to, because the parents, even if you're both non-injured, looking after someone with a brain injury is a challenge.
It's no doubt is extremely exhausting for the non-injured caregiver. And sometimes it may be necessary to count on other kids in the family because things still have to function. People
Mhm.
still have to pay the bills. People still have to get dinner on the table. People still have to do laundry. So it doesn't mean that the kids should be excluded or protected from taking on these roles. It's just finding that fine balance so that kids can still have experience of being kids, but at the same time, maybe they can help out in ways that makes sense for that family unit in order for that family unit to function, because that's needed.
Oh, absolutely. And I imagine you have to deal with a whole host of emotions that come up, both from the siblings, from parents, from spouses, depression, sometimes resentment of,
Yeah.
and I know that a lot of caregivers I speak with report feelings of guilt that
Mhm.
perhaps we've heard about survivor's guilt, but also caregiver guilt. Why should I complain about all the tough things it is to be a caregiver? I'm not the one with the brain injury.
That's right, and actually, that sometimes can come from the person with the brain injury. That, "Why should you feel distressed? I'm the one with the brain
You call
injury."
that a headache? Let me tell you about a headache.
Exactly. So it can come from either direction, but the guilt with the primary caregiver can be around, no, what has happened to their loved one and how they're having to renegotiate their lives in a different way. If there's been changes emotionally, physically, they can't work, their roles have changed. And so, understandably, there's a lot of distress around how this injury has impacted the loved one. But there could also be guilt around not feeling like they can do enough. Even though they've taken on all these roles, sometimes caregivers put a lot of pressure on themselves and
Mhm.
feel like, I ought to be able to fix this. And I see this a lot with parents. You know, parents assume a protective role for
Right.
their children. And it's quite natural for parents to feel like they should be able to protect their kids from everything. And so when they can't, there can be these feelings of guilt around, I'm not doing enough. I'm not working harder. I haven't fixed these things for my child. And the guilt can be exacerbated when the person with the injury experiences frustration,
Mm.
anxiety, and that invites a tendency to want to actually do more to fix those feelings of distress for the loved one. And the guilt can also be around not being able to spread yourself thin enough for the other members of the family, the other kids. Because often I talked about how sometimes the kids can take on some of the parental roles in the
Mhm.
family, and that's not something that's desired by anybody in the family. So there could be guilt from the primary caregiver around the kids having to help out a little bit, having to do the laundry, having to help with the dishes. They don't want that for the non injured family members, but sometimes it's necessary for functioning.
Well, and even and beyond a lot of the parental responsibilities, the caregivers often they're not only involved in trying to raise the kids often on their own, they have another job. They sometimes they're working full-time jobs. Sometimes they have to give up their job. So then that
Yeah.
causes a financial strain, and often the person with the brain injury can no longer work. So again, there are
No.
financial considerations coming in.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
That's such an important point to make, because those are the practicalities that are realities for a lot of families when there's a change in the financial situation because one person has to give up their job or both people have to give up their jobs.
So when you're facing something like that, how what approach do you take for that?
Well, I think it's important to acknowledge the financial strain
Right.
and encourage the family to explore resources and supports that could be helpful. If there's a medical legal case going on, to work with their lawyers around income
Mhm.
replacement benefits and dealing with the financial aspects that are causing a strain for the family, finding ways to help make ends meet. So again, working with a rehab team around
Mhm.
the financial issues, but with respect to work, to perhaps explore what might be feasible.
Mhm.
So, might part time work
Mhm.
be an option for the non injured spouse? And in fact, I've learned from some of the caregivers that sometimes work can be a form of respite. Because if the caregiver relationship is a very intensive relationship, so it's 24/7.
Mhm.
If the caregiver has to provide attendant care support, queuing, rehab support, it can be a lot for both parties. And as in any spousal relationship, 24/7 is a lot, and it can be a strain on even the healthiest of marriages. And so, in fact, exploring whether there could be time apart, whether part-time work might be feasible, that could help to address some of the financial strain, but
Right.
it can also be a potential way of mitigating the caregiver strain and the intensity of the relationship between spouses. I'm working with one spouse right now who is contemplating retiring, and she's just fearing her retirement, wondering, what
Yeah.
am I gonna do 24/7? I'm gonna need to figure out ways to have a break. And so we're exploring volunteer work when she retires and setting up the structures in a way where the person with the injury can take on some of the roles themselves a little bit more over time with the help of the rehab team, learn to manage medications, learn to manage schedules, routines, so that there could be some healthy separation between the caregiver and the person with the ABI.
I do know that many of the caregivers I've talked to do talk about they'd love to take a break, but they have this guilt or they have this worry that if they go away from their charges, if they go away from the person for whom they're giving care, that they're abandoning them and something could happen or
Ah,
they can't handle
right.
things.
And the word abandon is interesting because they're actually not abandoning the loved one with the
Mm,
ABI. It could actually be a healthy shift for the person with the ABI because that could be a very reasonable goal in many instances to figure out how can the person learn to manage some of the time on their own. So, is there a day program that they could go to? Are there other supports or programs that could help so that they could be more independent for part of the day while the primary caregiver explores activities for
takes a
self-care?
break.
Yeah, and to take a break. And it's important for caregivers to realize that taking a break is not abandoning your loved one. Taking a break, self-care can actually help your loved one because there's this assumption that when you're caring for a loved one, that you have to
Mhm.
be there all the time. Whereas taking a break can also be there for your loved one because it gives them the opportunity to learn some independence, some self sufficiency, which could be enhancing of their confidence. But taking care of yourself as a caregiver also helps your mood, helps depression, helps anxiety, helps with coping strategies. And when the caregiver is better, it's helping the loved one. So I often say to caregivers, if you want to take care of your loved one with the ABI, then taking care of yourself is also taking care of your loved one. And I often use the analogy of the oxygen mask on airplanes. And the
Oh, yeah.
attendants often saying, if there's an emergency, the oxygen mask comes down.
Mhm.
Who's the first person that you put it on? It's
Yeah.
yourself.
You got to look after yourself or you can't look after anybody else.
Exactly. You put it on yourself before you put it on your child. And it's the same thing. If you don't take care of yourself, you're not going to be as good in your caregiving role with your loved one.
You talked about how it definitely is a positive for the caregiver so that they can provide better care and recharge their battery, but also so that it gives a sense of self-esteem and self-worth to the person receiving the care. Have you experienced in your practice many times that sort of feeling of learned helplessness that people who are suffering from an injury, who are constantly having their needs met by someone else?
That can happen, and that's a really valid reason for fostering some healthy time apart so that the person with the injury can realize that they can take on some things, that they don't necessarily have to rely totally on the caregiver, and it would help them feel less like they're being taken care of like a child. So that part is really important to foster that kind of self-confidence, that self-efficacy around the things that they can manage. And that's where working with the rehab team to figure out what can the person take on safely on their own. And sometimes there might be mistakes that are made, but
Mhm.
assume that there could be safe mistakes that the person can learn from. And over time to build in strategies to compensate for that.
One of the things that you talked about in previous talks that I watched is that over time, the dynamic changes. Sometimes things get worse, that they start out a little better
Mhm.
and then they get worse once the realization hits that this is often going to be a chronic thing. This is not going to necessarily all fix itself in 12 to
Yeah.
15 weeks or whatever it is
Yeah.
that talk about.
That's right. That's a really interesting comment. And as we talk about this, I don't want the caregivers out there being discouraged when they hear that things might get worse. It's important to understand this from the perspective of the phase of rehabilitation, the recovery trajectory. So often at the beginning, when the person is first injured, people really have very little experience and insight around what that process is going to look like. So people often think once they're out of rehab, they get home, in a year, they'll be back to the way they were. So that's very common for
Yeah.
people to think
Both
that
both
way.
for the person having the brain injury and for the caregiver.
Exactly. So in the initial stages, there's a lot of hope that things will get back to the way they were, both on both parties, the caregiver and the person with the injury, as well as the other kids in the family. But over time, as the rehab progresses and going into year two, and things aren't back to the way they were, people begin to feel it a little bit more. And then family life hasn't gone back to normal. The person still may not be back at work. The caregiver is still heavily involved around cueing and supporting their loved one. So over time, as the realities sink in, people begin to feel it a little bit more. And frustrations begin to set in, and feelings of loss and grief can emerge more over time than at the beginning, because the initial period is that period of hopefulness that things will get back. But when people realize that, hey, maybe this may persist, maybe this is the way it is, maybe this is as good as it gets, that's when frustrations set in, feelings of grief and loss. And sometimes the way that people deal with those emotions is through their behaviors. And it plays itself out in terms of anger, because the flip side of sadness is anger.
Right.
And so when people are struggling with dealing with the grief and loss, it can come out through the behaviors. And so that's why it can often feel like things are getting worse, and the experience of burden can intensify over time. The other reality is our public healthcare system.
Mm.
So often the services and supports are there at the beginning when people are in hospital. And then when they're discharged, they can have access to outpatient rehab if they're lucky enough to live in a community that
Yeah.
has that. And many communities in Ontario don't. And so there's the supports to help initially, but that phases out over time. And so there are very few community-based supports available in the publicly funded system. So there's less help. And so that increases the strain and the burden on families as well. So it's not that things are actually getting worse. It's just that things haven't gotten better or recovered to the point that people had anticipated, and there may be fewer supports down the road compared to at the beginning. So I think it's important to understand that from the context of the system and how the recovery naturally progresses. Because brain injury, we know, is often lifelong for people.
Mhm.
And so even though the injury may be permanent, families need to realize that there's still hopefulness for family life to reorganize and to settle into a new normal. Families can get better at learning strategies. Families can get better at figuring out what works and what helps their family. So even though the injury may be ongoing or permanent, families can get wiser in how they deal with the injury.
And it must be a longer road, I would imagine, than for someone, for example, who was put into a wheelchair or who lost their sight, where you know right away that you're looking at lifelong. You're not fooling yourself about this. One of the frustrations I know that survivors and caregivers have is that brain injury is often an invisible injury. It is,
Yes.
it is, I know that one of the big frustrations that I had as a caregiver and still have was dealing with insurance companies that would say, well, post-concussion syndrome resolves itself in a few months and she still has it. It must be they don't say this, but they imply that it must be her imagination or she's overdoing it or whatever else.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think from my own experience and the experience talking to other caregivers and survivors, one of the big frustrations is because it's an invisible injury, they expect it to resolve itself. And because one of the views of, for example, a concussion, you sit in a dark room and you're fine in a few months. And when it isn't fine, I think there is a frustration that sets in that I don't think perhaps that you might not see if it was a more physically obvious injury.
And the invisible aspects of the ABI are often really difficult for people to negotiate because the person looks fine on
Mhm.
the outside. They look like their old selves, but they may be thinking differently or behaving differently. And so it can fool the caregivers, and they can sometimes they're not fully convinced that it's the ABI. They may think that they're doing it on purpose because they can't see the ABI.
Right. And one of the things that you often notice is that someone with an ABI in public, in dealing with people who are
Yeah.
not their caregivers, they put on what I call their Facebook face, their best
Right.
face. Everything's fine. It's not actually that bad. And then they get home for their caregivers and they go, I
Yeah.
feel awful. Oh, and their
Yeah.
eyes are closed and the eye mask is on and the room is dark and they're in terrible shape. And it's often a big surprise for some of the caregivers that I've talked to.
That's right.
Um,
And it really confuses them because then they wonder, well, he or she is able to behave out there and they're fine. But when they come home, they take it out at me and they do that. And so it takes some time to convince the caregivers that actually it is a
mm,
legitimate ABI effect. And they have to work so hard out in public to put on their Facebook face or the game face and to behave, and then when they get home, they let loose. But it's just like kids. They're behaving at school and they're listening to the teacher and the structure and they're good with their friends. But when they get home, they could be tired. They could be
right.
overwhelmed, fatigued, overstimulated. So that can come out through the behaviors. So it can be a very isolating experience for the caregiver because others don't see what the caregiver has to live with on a day-to-day basis. They see the best sides of that loved one. And it's not just friends, but it's also relatives
Hmm.
or other extended family members that they don't see the full extent of what the caregiver has to deal with. And so it's often in speaking with other caregivers that they get that validation and support and acknowledgement. Yes, I know what you're talking about. I live with this every
Hmm.
day. So the invisible nature of the injury is often hard. And even though caregivers may have bought into this being an ABI effect, I sometimes get caregivers say to me, I know, Caron, you've told me, and I really get that it's the ABI that's making him behave this way, but sometimes I just forget. Even though it could be 3, 4 years down the road, because there's not bandages around the head, there's not a cane, there's not a wheelchair, the person still looks the way they used to be, even though they know they can still forget when they're caught up in the dynamic.
I can see how that definitely might happen. And you talked about, I'd like to move into the second part of our talk today, and that is you mentioned how important it is for caregivers to talk to other caregivers, and to really sympathize without it turning into a bitch session or complaining about their charges, the people that they're for whom they're giving care. I think when I talked to you earlier, you talked about, when I asked you which type of therapy do you tend to prefer to work with, individual versus couples versus family. I think you'd
Right.
always tend to lean towards dealing with the family because
Yeah.
of the dynamic.
And even though I may just be working with one individual, such as the caregiver, or just the person with the injury, or a sibling, I still adopt a family systems framework. So I think about the ripple effect that other family members are experiencing. Sometimes it's not feasible to see the entire family. People may not be ready, people may not want to, but also sometimes people need an opportunity to process the changes or the losses or the grief or trauma on their own. So, for example, a caregiver, it's not uncommon for caregivers to experience depression, loss, even PTSD, post traumatic
Really?
stress reactions. It's not uncommon. And I see that a lot with parents when they have witnessed their child in the ICU. They're being
Yeah.
given horrible news. This
Not
happens
something
with
you forget.
spouses as
Yeah.
well. It's not something you forget, and it's very traumatizing to witness your loved one in the ICU, doctors giving you horrible prognosis or horrible news, not knowing if your loved one is going to live or not. That trauma doesn't go away readily. So, caregivers in that kind of situation
Mhm.
often need the opportunity to work through that trauma on a one-to-one basis. So I wouldn't suggest couple therapy or family therapy for
No,
that.
not for
I
that.
would
No.
recommend more one-on-one, but then we can morph into the family system impact. How are they dealing with the other members of the family? How are they dealing with their loved one, given that the trauma effects have hit them so hard? So I still expand it to a family system perspective. The other thing with couple therapy is sometimes the person with the injury is not interested in engaging in couple therapy or may not be ready. If you think about it, they're already inundated with having to participate in physiotherapy,
Physiotherapy, name
occupational
it, you name
therapy,
it. Goes on and on.
psychology. That's right. So they can only participate in so many therapies. And so it's not uncommon for them to not be part of couple therapy, especially in the initial stages. I often see them down the road when the therapies have subsided a little bit more. But ideally, if they can participate in couple therapy when the time is right, those are opportunities for couples to work out different ways of communicating with one another, different ways of navigating the role changes, and helping them learn different language that helps to unite them as a couple, because sometimes it can feel like they're against one another. They're being told what to do. The caregiver feels like a boss or a parent to them, and they resent that. And so they resist, which can create tension within the relationship. And the caregiver feels like there's a lot that's on them to have to get them to comply with rehab recommendations. So ideally in those situations, to get them together in the same room, to figure out what's the ultimate goal, what's the shared goal. And often the shared goal is for the person to get back more of their old life and for the caregiver to be able to step back a little bit because that is the desired outcome, and to get them to talk about it from a united perspective can help lessen some of the friction and the tension in the relationship. Getting them to talk about what works, getting them to talk about the successes, the appreciations of one another. And so often after an injury, the discourse or the conversations get focused on brain injury talk. What's
Mm.
different? What's been lost? What are the deficits? What's the rehab? And so what's healthy in the relationship can get lost in the course of that.
So you help them establish that new normal that you spoke of earlier. Their
Yeah,
relationship now enters it's not the same relationship they had before the brain injury. It's a different one, but it doesn't mean it's gone. It's just different.
exactly. What's the new normal? But what are some new appreciations that can develop in spite of the changes? So not all changes have to be bad
Right.
or not undesired. There are some changes that can be a silver lining. And it reminds me of a couple that I worked with where the male partner was one of these proud individuals, and he really wanted to be self-sufficient and not look like he had a disability.
Right.
And he had some balance issues. And so rather than go for a walk with a cane, he asked his wife to hold hands with him so he didn't look disabled out
Mhm.
in public. And the caregiver said to me afterwards, that was the most loving thing that we've done in decades
Wow.
because we've been married for over 30 years. And Karen, do you know how many decades I've asked him to hold my hand when we go for walks? And he
Wow.
wouldn't. And it took the brain injury and him needing some support so he wouldn't lose his balance. It took that to get them to hold hands.
That's amazing.
And so that was the silver lining and an example of not everything has to be a negative. There could be some wonderful, loving things that can happen in a family in spite of the brain injury. And so it's looking for those moments, looking for those nuggets, looking for the silver lining. And kids can develop different appreciations of their parents. I've
Hmm.
been working with someone who was one of these parentified kids when her mother got injured. And 20 years later, she's able to reflect on the conversations and she's able to talk about how strong it's made her family and how much she admired her dad for having taken on these roles and raised the family in spite of their mom being injured. So it helped her to appreciate all these strengths about her parents and how her mom, in spite of the stroke, is still the most loving mom and caring mom in spite of it. So kids can learn to shift their view of how family life has become and the wonderful things that they have learned and taken from that experience.
So there is definitely silver lining. Do you find something you said there made me think? Do you find is the dynamic different when the injured person is male versus when the injured person is female, for example, in a spousal relationship or a parental relationship? Is the reaction, are they grumpier if they're men, or they're less likely to share what they need, or less likely to want help? Or perhaps that's not gender-based, perhaps it's more the
Yeah.
personality of the person.
It is more the person, but it's not uncommon that I have learned that often the guys like to have some practical solutions, some
Right.
practical ideas. So, what can we do about it? and is there something we can fix here? Is there something that we can modify? And it's not uncommon for the females in the family to need to process the losses and the disappointments and the frustrations a little bit more. So it's getting partners on the same page that, yes, you need to have some practical strategies for how to negotiate what has changed, but there also needs to be time focused on the losses, the disappointments, the sadness. And so sometimes people may shy away from addressing those emotions. It could be gender based, but it could be based on how they were brought up, that you don't talk about feelings, the stiff upper lip, cultural differences
Culturally, I was going to
around
say.
dealing with emotions. So it could be based on a variety of different factors, but it's not uncommon for people to come in with different preferences for how they negotiate things. Some may be more feeling based and some may be more practical and strategy based. But
Right.
the goal is to acknowledge both are important, that it's not one or the other. It's to appreciate the differences in coping styles,
Mhm.
but more importantly, coming together to support one another and maybe to learn one another's coping style. And in couple therapy, sometimes it's called learning a different love language. That people have different love languages, have different ways of expressing love and affection for one another. And it's learning not just to speak your own language, but it's learning to speak your partner's language, because that's what will help them come together to figure out the best path forward.
It really hits the nail on the head. It's a relationship that has had quite a bit of trauma introduced to it, but it
Yes.
is still a relationship, and it has to evolve over time. People need to understand what their own love languages are so that they can communicate them properly to their partner. And really, again, that's regardless of what your background is, that needs to be
Mhm.
explored. So the therapy is so important. And you mentioned in one of your talks that the earlier it begins, the better.
Yes, because at the early stages, they're thrust into this new world of brain injury, not really knowing what it entails, how it's going to evolve, what it's going to look like, that it may be lifelong. And so the earlier I can get in there, the better in terms of just basic education about brain injury. What does that look like? What are the different aspects of brain injury beyond the physical? What
Mhm.
might you anticipate in terms of cognitive changes or emotional behavioral changes? And even though the person with the ABI may not be at that stage yet of exhibiting a lot of the invisible aspects of the injury, just providing that information at the beginning helps to set the stage, because down the road, maybe a year or two down the road, when they start seeing that, they may appreciate, oh, that's what the therapist was referring to when we were in the hospital, that he or she might exhibit these things. Now I get it. That's why they told me. So they often remember that it may have been introduced, even though it didn't make sense to them at those beginning stages. And I think what the research tells us is that people need access to that information throughout the life course, depending on what happens, because what you learn at the initial stages is relevant for what you needed at that point. But down the road, as rehab progresses, you hear things differently at year 2, at year 3, and so people need to be reintroduced to some of that education, and they're going to understand it differently because there's going to be more of a lived experience around dealing with those changes. And when people are dealing with life transitions, they may need an opportunity to revisit therapy at that time, because life transitions, like a child graduating into high school, or someone transitioning to adulthood,
Mhm.
or if you're a parent, your kids are getting older, or you're launching your adult children out of the home. So all those different life transitions are times of normal heightened stress.
I
Excuse me.
imagine like if you're going to a graduation and one of your other, if you're a parent of someone with a brain injury and one of your other children is graduating from high school and you realize, well, the one with the brain injury may never graduate or not graduate in the same way, or one is giving birth or off to marriage or whatever else. You talk
Yeah.
about that as episodic loss reactions. People.
That's right. So those life transitions can evoke those feelings of loss and sadness and grief again. And it could be not necessarily a life transition. It could be something really benign. And I'm thinking of a parent whose son had quite a significant brain injury
Mhm.
and was visually impaired and required a lot of mobility supports. So she was riding the subway in Toronto. I don't know if you have any experience riding the subway in Toronto
Too
during
much,
rush hour,
unfortunately,
how
yes.
awful that is. But she was riding the subway to work, and all of a sudden, this throng of annoying teenagers came on the subway with their backpacks. And they were turning around and hitting all the other people with their backpacks and all the other customers looking at them with annoyance. And this mother watched this scenario and started feeling so sad because she realized for herself, my son will never be one of those annoying teenagers. And so something as simple and benign as that brought about these feelings of grief and loss for
So
her
how do
again.
you deal with those? What do you say to someone like that that's going through that?
Yeah, I prepare families for that. I let them know ahead of time that they've worked through some of those initial feelings of loss and that they're really to be commended for their bravery for working through some of those difficult emotions. But it doesn't mean that's the end. That over time that they're going to re-experience these feelings
Hmm.
again. It could be during an anniversary reaction of the injury. It could be during graduation, or it could be when one of your sons or daughters gets married, that those would be common times when you might re experience the grief. But it could also be a benign, unexpected event that triggers the loss. And I give them examples. So I try to normalize that these are common experiences that every caregiver will go through and that it's normal, that
So
it's
not to minimize the
okay.
experience and say your kid's doing fine when grief is a natural emotion that we all work through.
Yeah. And to give yourself permission to feel it, that that's okay, that you're going through at that time and you will move through it and be able to move on. But to give yourself permission that it's a valid, healthy response. So I don't want them pathologizing themselves, that it's unhealthy or that they're regressing or going backwards, that this is part of moving forward.
And it's an important part of moving forward, and it'll
Yeah,
happen again and again.
that's
Now,
right.
you talked about therapy over time, and obviously one of the reasons we're talking and in your experience, therapy is probably one of the best ways of dealing with a lot of the emotional minefield that is caregiving and going through traumatic or acquired brain injury. But what about people who cannot necessarily afford that? Again, we talked about financial impacts of a brain injury. There are many of the people who have gone through it that I know their money can be tight at times.
Mm.
Are there some other resources, there are ways of dealing with it that don't necessarily involve sitting down with a therapist?
It's a real luxury and privilege to be able to afford therapy. And so it's not fully accessible to everybody, and particularly in different parts of the province. Sometimes the specialized supports are less available. Getting specialized brain injury therapy can be really hard for some communities. And ideally, if people can have access to a brain injury specialist, that's the ideal scenario. If they can't, or if that's unaffordable, sometimes exploring publicly funded family counseling supports. And even that is hard to get in some communities. But sometimes through family service associations, or if people have workplace benefits, perhaps through their EAP programs, employee assistant programs. Sometimes people have access to 6 sessions of counseling support, perhaps through extended healthcare benefits if they have access to social work, psychotherapy, or psychology. Sometimes that can provide limited supports. I can't believe how many plans have a cap of $500 for therapy.
Oh, yeah.
$500 doesn't pay for a lot of therapy.
We'll just tweak you and fix you up and you're all better now.
That's right. So if people have to access non-brain injury specialists, that is some form of support, and that's okay. But perhaps that can be augmented with information for that therapist that is more ABI specific. And so there's lots of really good web resources around ABI, what's common after ABI. There's workshops. There's a course called ABI Brain Basics through the Ontario Brain Injury Association that people can enroll in. So that's available to therapists, that's available to caregivers, that's available to friends and family. There's also an e-line version that is more affordable. So even though people may not be able to get therapy, they can access some of the brain injury related information and education on their own. And it's a great way of learning about what happens after a brain injury. What does the course of recovery look like? What's that trajectory look like? What are cognitive changes and the strategies? What are physical changes? What are emotional behavioral? And so those are sources of information.
We'll link to those. Yeah.
There's also an excellent caregiver website on the Ontario Brain Injury website that
That's the
caregivers
OBIA
can.
website, Ontario Brain Injury Association.
Yes. And again, there are different modules specifically for caregivers on what happens after a brain injury, dealing with relationship changes, impact on the family, coping strategies, stress management, caregiver burden, and resource information. So I would encourage caregivers to check that out as well, because people can go about it at their own pace and they can revisit the different modules at different times because different aspects of the brain injury may be more relevant at different stages.
Yeah.
So those are ideas about some of the resources for people who don't have opportunities to engage in couple or family therapy with a brain injury specialist.
And there are associations such as BIAYR, Brain Injury Association, York Region, and which is the Brain Injury Society, I think it's Society, yes, of Toronto, as well as the national one, which doesn't occur to me right now, but again, they're all online and we can link to those. In your experience as a therapist, as someone acquires more knowledge, even if it's just not therapy, as they acquire more knowledge about brain injury and the effects that brain injury have on behavior and on their lives, do you find that the depression and the anxiety is better managed? Is they're better able to deal with it?
They're better able to manage it when they understand the changes and have different coping strategies. And I also encourage caregivers to reflect on self-care strategies. And so it's not just learning about the brain injury, it's learning ways of taking care of themselves and avoiding burnout. And
recognizing that that's necessary.
Absolutely. The stress management is critical because the toll that caregiving takes on people is huge. And I think there was a comment earlier that sometimes they feel guilty if they have to take time for themselves. But I think it's really important to underscore that this is for the long haul. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And if people don't take care of themselves, it's going to be hard.
Never
and
make the
you're at
finishing.
risk of burnout. And then if you burn out, you can't be as helpful to the person with the ABI or the other people in the family. And one of the things that I often do when caregivers put themselves at the end of the line is when I'm working with a family system, I'll ask the kids in the family, who do you worry most about? And it's not uncommon for them to identify the parent without the ABI as
Uh,
the person they're most worried about. So they may say, oh, I worry most about mom. And mom may be a caregiver of their sibling, or the mom may be the caregiver of their dad. And then what is that you worry about, mom? Well, mom's always so stressed. That's such a common reflection from the kids. Mom's always so stressed. Well, what happens when she's stressed? Well, she forgets things or she starts getting cranky, and then she looks like she's all over the place. And so how does that stress affect you? What do you worry about? And so they talk about their worry about their mom, and it makes them want to help out more, and it makes them worry that they might not be able to manage certain things. And so the kids start worrying more because they see
oh,
the
it's a
parent.
domino effect because you're not looking
Yeah,
after yourself.
yeah.
Not only can you not look after the person with the brain injury, the stress rolls downhill. And
And so often that works because parents are so committed to their
ah,
kids.
right.
Parents will do anything for their kids. They may not do it for themselves, but if they do stress management because it's good for their kids, they will do it. So
Oh,
having that family system framework is often very helpful and could be a real resource for me when I'm working with families. That's why I love incorporating the voices of kids in therapy.
is that something you need to remind sometimes parents who are looking after someone with a brain injury that they do have other children, that they have children, period? It's not just their husband, because often I've heard people who are in a family where there's someone with a brain injury say, well, mom says to me, listen, you're not the one with your brother is the one we need to worry about, or
Yeah,
your sister's the one we need to worry about. Deal with it. This
yeah,
is the thing. You encourage different language than that, and that, for example,
absolutely.
to remind the parent that there are other people affected. It's not just the brain injury.
Absolutely. I really try to underscore that the other kids in the family also have legitimate and valid needs. That, yes, the person with a brain injury needs more time and attention, but they don't need more love. Every child in that family is deserving of the same amount of love. And so, yes, there are huge responsibilities for the person with the injury, but it's equally important to take time for the other kids in the family. And so I often encourage to make dates or play dates if it's younger kids, dates with the non-injured kids, because if they don't experience that time and attention from the parent, it may not be the same as before injury, but they still need those doses of love and attention, because that will help to keep that dynamic healthy. That will lessen resentment against the sibling who's injured or against the parent who's injured.
Or I imagine even
And
guilt, feeling like as a non-injured sibling that you shouldn't be resenting. You're
that's
resenting the
right.
sibling and then feeling guilty about having resentment.
That's right. Or it can help to prevent behavior problems. So kids can act out their distress through their behaviors. And so it's not uncommon for the non injured kids in the family to maybe experience changes at school, changes in friendships. They may act out more in order to get attention. There could be physical ailments.
Hmm.
And so, a way of averting that is to make sure that they get the love and attention that they deserve. Now, having said that, it's not necessarily just the child who's acting out. It
Really?
can also be the good, perfect child, because sometimes kids overcompensate by being studious at school, doing everything that they're told, not acting out, stepping up and taking on parental roles. And it doesn't mean that they're not suffering. They could also be feeling it, but overcompensating. And in one of the videos that I showed in one of my
Mm.
talks, the young woman, she was a teenager, I think 15 or
Yes.
16,
Yeah.
when her mother got injured, and she had to step up to take on a parental role
Mhm.
with her younger sibling. And she talked about how she felt like she lost out on her childhood.
Yeah.
So she was one of these kids who did everything right, didn't complain, took on a role with her sibling, but she was still feeling it. And so that needs to be acknowledged. And I think parents need to recognize that
Absolutely.
as well.
Yeah. I noticed the other one that just came just before her mentioned how her brain injured brother was actually verbally abusive and emotionally abusive towards her.
Yes,
And it got worse the longer she stayed there, to the point where she moved out when she was 21, very early.
that's
Um,
right.
and when I'm listening to her talk about this, I'm thinking, well, where were her parents in this? What were they saying to her that he was able to talk to her this way, that he was able to treat her this way?
Mhm,
There has to be
mhm.
some dialogue there, I would think, that you have a brain injury. It's terrible that you have this brain injury, and it's a huge challenge, and we have to deal with that. But that's a reason you may feel irritable or abusive, but that's not an excuse.
Absolutely. And so even though education around these changes equally important is how to manage these changes so that it creates a healthier dynamic. So just because anger control or impulse control is a feature of brain injury doesn't mean they can get away with it.
Yeah.
They still have to learn ways of calming the situation, and siblings or other people in the family may need to learn more strategic ways or constructive ways of dealing with it. So, for example, they may need to learn ways of disengaging instead of arguing back or yelling back, or de escalation strategies. And once things are calm, then talk about it. Talk about what's okay, what's not okay. So the brain injury may require people to deal with it slightly differently, but it doesn't give it an excuse to just accept it and go along with it.
That's good advice for anyone in any relationship. When you have the conflict show up, regardless of the reason for the conflict, yelling at each other louder isn't going to help anything. That's definitely is one of the other things that occurred to me is that you talked about how watching someone go through a brain injury, particularly for some of the parents, seeing their child in the hospital, whatever, it's almost like a trauma. They almost suffer PTSD after that. One of the things that I've also noticed is that people who suffer brain injuries, it isn't just the physical trauma that they suffer. It's often the emotional trauma that associated perhaps with a car accident or some other precipitating factor. One of the things that brain injury survivors have talked to me about is how the people around them, despite their best intentions, will trigger episodes, will trigger anxiety and depression in the person who has survived the brain injury, or trigger anger in them because they're using language or they're talking about certain things. Have you ever encountered that?
Yes, and that's where open dialogue and communication is so important, because even though they may be triggering reactions in the person with the ABI, it may not be intentional. And so if people don't know it's a trigger, then how are they supposed to change that? And so having an open conversation to be able to talk about it in a safe place, and encouraging people to use I language, so that those are common communication strategies that I try to encourage with everybody. Because often when we're upset with somebody, we'll use you language. You did this, you did that, you shouldn't do that. And so just to soften it and talk about things from an I perspective,
Right.
I feel really hurt when those words are used, or I feel really agitated when you bring up that topic. And when a person uses the I language to communicate the distress or the trauma that it's creating, it sets the stage for the other person to be able to hear it a little bit more and to talk
Right.
about it. They're not put on the defense and being backed into a corner or feeling like they're blamed. And ideally, for both parties to talk about what their experience is and what could be more helpful. So it's not just what they're doing wrong, but what happens when that language is used and what could be alternative language that could be more enhancing of their coping.
And that's important. I've noticed that for certain people, certain languages is triggering. For others, it has no effect at all. To make sure that that's communicated and said, this is the language you shouldn't be using, but how about you use this instead? So, for example, I've had a brain injury person going through brain injury say that they don't like the word survivor. They don't
Yeah.
like that to them. It triggers the accident that caused it. They survived the accident. They're at least they're not dead. There are a lot of people that have no trouble talking about their accident. They'll talk about it every session. Other people don't want to hear about it at all because
Hmm.
they'd rather
Hmm.
just move on from that. So to give people alternative language, give them
Yes.
language to avoid, terms to avoid, that type of thing. I've noticed over time has been very helpful, and I'm sure it's been helpful for you in your therapy sessions.
And because I don't know what words are triggering and I don't know what alternative language could be helpful, that's where bringing the voice of the person who's experiencing that is so important. And it actually could be very empowering and skill building
Yeah.
for that person to be able to articulate what their experience is, what they're feeling using I language
Hmm.
instead of communicating it through behavior,
Right.
which can be
Right.
the default.
And to make clear to the person who is perhaps triggered that feeling or whatever, that they didn't do really anything wrong.
That's
They didn't
right.
set out to traumatize someone with a trigger word. They either were not aware that it was a trigger word or they forgot.
Mhm,
And that can happen too. I've seen
mhm.
it where, oh, darn, even after 5, 10, 15, 20 years, you say something and you go, oh, and to not beat yourself up about it. You didn't do it on
Yeah,
purpose.
that's right. And so having a climate of openness, honesty, and regular communication are tools that can help all families navigate the life after ABI.
And it is so important to have people like you and helping people directly and helping people that you've never met by spreading the word, by giving educational talks, by helping out with the ABI website and providing links, educating people on better communication in general. So again, Caron, thank you very much for agreeing to talk with us. You've been extremely helpful. I have learned an incredible amount, and I'm going to continue to learn over these years. But the profession is going to be less without you in it. I hope we can find more people like you that are willing to step in and help people resolve what is a very traumatic thing. Can be a very
Mhm.
traumatic thing. Um, Thank you so much for speaking with us today, and we'll put this up and hopefully get it edited by people with more experience than me. And we'll talk again soon. Hopefully we can continue our conversation at a later date.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and it's been such an honor and privilege and a wonderful way to wind down my career. Thank
Karen.
you.
Yeah.
Bye.